Yeah, my name is Byron Sigcho Lopez, and I'm the Alderman of the 25th Ward. So zoning is an important, can be a very powerful tool for our community to see the projects and to shape the kind of development that we want to see. Obviously, for us, conscious development is important because we want to maintain the social fabric of the community, and for that, we need to create affordable housing. We need to create conscious development. As we've seen, unfortunately, for over 2 decades, the misuse of that power, and for us to have a zoning code and to, and they need to be changed, right? So for zoning codes to be reflective of the needs of the community, right? So we have a zoning code that, it is under the new administration probably going to be evolving guidelines that will be hopefully changed to empower residents to make sure that these codes or the decisions are reflective of the needs. Oftentimes you see, the difficulties of residents who say, well, I want to come back to my community, but, I need to, change the zoning because now it's mixed use and I want to go back to residential. And they don't even understand the process. How can we go about it? So we obviously trying to, obviously when the big development happens, right? Right now, for instance, San Adalbert is a church that is at the center of controversy, and big developers are all over, to, impose their views of what development think that they should look like. What we want to say is like, no, we want to make sure that the residents are also vetting this, and then we want to make sure that we see all of our alternatives. San Adalbert is a historic site. Ironically, is outside the historic landmark proposal that is being discussed right now. And to see developers eyeing, trying to take over, trying to hold back the process, trying to buy their way into the community, obviously is the same thing that we've seen for so long. But now, thanks to, the discussion around zoning, we propose, hey, we want to rezone this to make sure that we have a discussion. So make sure that we have all the alternatives at the table so that we talk about preservation, we talk about landmarking, these kind of historic sites, and that these sites, if they are going to change, they change with the community, for the community, and not to the will of developers that they think that money buys all. And money buys everything. I think that we have alternatives. We are creative. We have many. Arquitectos is one of those groups that have been discussing about this, and I think that we should be having more intentional conversations about what do those alternatives look like. This if you look at the San Adalbert, that's a landmark on its own. That's the highest point in Pilsen. It has a very from the architectural point of view, is a very iconic site. What it means for the residents, what it means for the parishioners, but also what it means, historically and, for the landmarking purposes, right? But yet developers, want to just take over and do as they please, right? So we need to have a conversation about what the residents like to see, what we expand the conversation, and we want to have the options, have a discussion about the kind of development that we want to see to make sure that we balance development, but also the social fabric. That's preservation. So we talk about preservation, we cannot talk only about preserving the buildings, we must talk about preserving the social fabric, and that's fundamentally the people of Pilsen. And that's one thing that this, right now we're in a defining moment, and we want to make sure that we are very clear that our commitment to transparency, accountability, and inclusion is at the forefront. Our zoning decisions, economic development decisions, and we see people eager to participate, and we must give them that space. And those conversations are fundamental to make sure that people can see more diverse communities, more thriving communities, to challenge the history and the legacy of segregation that unfortunately continues to be an issue in our city. But we believe that if we continue to push and we empower more people, we can be a blueprint to what conscious development can look like, to what other communities can do. And Pilsen has resisted for a long time. And I think that the community is one of those communities that is creative and is resilient. So I'm very optimistic about what we can do if we empower people to take those decisions. I mean, I don't know if the code itself can do, because the number of things that is there's no silver bullet, to tackle the issues of displacement, right? And I think like people, obviously change is a constant in life. Change is inevitable. What the change looks like is what people really want to be part of it. Everybody wants to be part of this conversation. The issue is that these conversations have always been behind doors. It's always been for the technocrats who know that, okay, this is what you need. But it excludes the people who are lived it today. So there has to be a direct connection between those who make policies and those who live the policy. And that's the key. If we are determined to make this happen, it has to be for the people we're supposed to serve. And I believe, firmly that zoning, it is one of those options, right? The zoning code, it can have different, there can be many proposals about what zoning code can look like. Of course, we gotta look at like how things have changed, Right now, when we talk about the rezone of the church, people were surprised that we're rezoning a church, but that is completely legal. And what the zoning looks like and what we can do to preserve landmark can be, can be subject to discussion, right? Can be zone zoning, because in the absence of a zoning code, right? What that looks like, is up in the air, right? What we're trying to guarantee is a process where people don't find about their end result after the fact, but they are part of the process. Okay, well, if we want to have 100% affordable housing and maintain the church, right, or whatever that proposal is, we need to make sure that we have all the options at the table. We cannot just leave it up to one developer or one alderman to say, okay, you figure out what's best. No, let's have a conversation. Let's shape out the zoning code to say, okay, this is a code that is in line with the needs of the community. This is a zoning decision that is driven by the community. So the community residents say, okay, well, this is what's happening in our backyard. These are our options, and this is what we think is best for us. And I think those conversations are fundamental for a democratic process, for good policy, for policy that really thinks about the needs, right? So I think that these conversations will evolve over time, but they haven't happened before. I think that for so long we have a top-down approach, and residents demand much better than that. They demand much better of our city. They demand much better of the public officials to be included, to participate. And I think the issue of zoning codes or zoning decisions or guidelines for zoning fundamentally have to be transparent, they have to be inclusive, and they have to be citywide. We need to have a better process to make sure that the projects are better by the residents, that ultimately the residents should be included in whatever affects their livelihood, and that we have options available for them. When we limit those options by backroom deals or lack of guidelines or clear guidelines, I think we all lose. We all lose our creativity, we lose the possibilities, and we lose the opportunity to really reshape the kind of city that we want to see. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that's why in the last city council session, I passed an ordinance that protects homeowners for predatory tactics by developers or real estate agents. The importance of having clear guidelines on how developers can approach whoever, so we cannot control who buys and sells, right? But what we can make sure is that the conditions of these transactions are fair. So when we see potential collusion between developers and inspectors, right? Or we have residents who say, look, my building is being targeted by, inspectors to the point that it's not up to make sure the building's up to code. Seems like, anything and everything, right? And I don't have access to capital to make those changes. So we gotta make sure that we protect them to say, look, we are, failing our system, failing our city if the system is failing, if we have developers or real estate agents that are preying on the most vulnerable. seniors, people who don't, whose first language is not English, and pressure into making decisions, especially now when we have property taxes that are skyrocketing. And we have, and we have stories of people that call them to their home, call them to their work, go to their houses, and then you have inspectors like her. So of course people feel harassed, overwhelmed, and ultimately they may be forced to make a bad decision. Now, if people want to sell, we want to make sure that they sell under the right conditions and in their time. And we want to make sure that the city is there to make sure that the building codes are followed, not to harass them, and put them in a situation where not only they dealing with high property taxes, and we have a property tax system that is broken, where we have buildings downtown that sell for 100 million, but they assess for 50 million, right? But then you go to their neighborhoods and they say, look, your building, you bought it for 100,000, but now it's worth 500,000, right? That is broken, right? And then we need like Springfield, we need a number of things to happen to address that. And in the meantime, we have this kind of predatory behavior. So of course, we have the, in Logan Square, 20,000 people living, in Pilsen 10,000. And we'll continue to see that unless we regulate this and, these conditions to make sure that we are there and we're following the law. I think that, people who have money also, have taking over public institutions, and the rules are set up there, for them. So now the legislation that we pass is like, you will have to wait, once you make your proposal and you were denied, you have to wait 180 days before you can again, put another proposal. So we don't want people to be harassed, and also we will be monitoring very closely and working with the Inspector General, if there are inspectors that are in any way colluding with developers, or we have, because in Pilsen we have seen a lot, and we're looking into the data to see how aggressive these inspections have been. So you have a lot of variables here, you see. So from the to making sure that we protect home ownership, right, which is fundamental, and until we address the issue of property tax assessments, we got to make sure that people are not harassed and that we find resources to help them stay in their home. And again, and even if they want to sell, that they sell under their conditions and not in a rush and no pressure, so that they can go to whoever they think will give them the best deal. So that was an ordinance that I passed, with 30 aldermen supporting it, and we have to do more. We got to do more in terms of property tax assessments to protect the long-term homeowners, to the seniors, the most vulnerable. We'll continue to work in that line, and in terms of the building codes, and we will make sure that the city's intention is not to gather more revenue, to gather at the expense of putting people in a harmful situation where they have to sell their home. But that we are there to make sure that the building code is followed, right? So there's a difference when the goal is to make sure that. So are we doing this to make sure the building is up to code, or are we doing this, for revenue, or worse if it's for special interest? So those are the things that we're really concerned about. But within that, so we talk about building code, we got a zoning code. We're trying to think about all the different elements, right, that goes into protecting the social fabric of the community. So it's not a one policy. It's a number of approaches that can help us preserve home ownership, expand home ownership. But when the conditions are and the speculation is so rampant, we have to rely on these policies. Building codes, zoning decisions are important policies. We want to make sure that are at the center or helping us protect the social fabric and not accelerating the process. So in terms of the zoning, and the zoning proposal, and unfortunately right now, at the state level, there's a ban on any kind of or form of rent control. That's when I was I was a director of Pilsen Lions, one of the first fights that we took on in lifting the ban on rent control. Because what you just mentioned, right? There's no way right now constitutionally for us to, link them maybe with assessments, right? For instance, right now, like a problem that we have right now in the city of Chicago, like you mentioned, New York, is that in New York, the assessments do reflect the kind of income levels generated by the property. So right now, a developer can have a 3-flat, have an income of $10,000, and another long-term residence can have the same square footage, generate a quarter of that in rent, but pay the same taxes. So it's impossible for you to compete with that, right? So at the extent that we're able to link that, and that's what I think progressive taxation is important, that you're taxing the ability to pay, right? That makes us have an even system of assessments. We don't have that right now. And it's banned almost at so right now we have the issues of what affordable housing unfortunately means. So right now, affordable housing, for instance, in broad terms, is really not even really creating opportunities for the most vulnerable, like the people who are making 30% of AMI, the average median income. They're not getting any affordable housing. So right now, like most of the projects, that's 60% of the average median income that in Cook County, that in practical terms will be created is, an average of $60,000 a year, which is not what families are making. So they leave a huge number of people left out. So we definitely, obviously that's what I want to reform the ARO. We want to reform, so that the affordable requirement ordinance and the average median income maybe can be determined by the local income. The local income in Pilsen up to a few years ago, that may have changed drastically now, but it was like $34,000, $35,000 a year for a family. They will be left out of this kind of affordable housing. So there's a lot more that we need to create. That's what I think, that's what, obviously we have institutions like the Chicago Housing Authority, right, that need to create more public housing, need to create more affordable housing for seniors, for families, because we're not nearly creating enough. Most of the market creates 1 and 2 bedrooms. That's most of the development that is happening. So we need to make sure that we regulate so that we can create more affordable housing for families, for seniors, and the affordable unit reflects the income that families and neighborhoods have, which is very different of the average, right? So there's a lot to be done in terms of policy. The issue of rent control, right, is one that has across the, I believe, 11 wards where a referendum was put in place. Around 70% of people believe that we must have some sort of rent stabilization. And rent stabilization, again, like in New York, it can be tacked to your property taxes, right? So that it's not that we are gonna harm the landlords, we want to make sure that we keep up also, well, of course, with the property taxes and the cost of living. But at what point this has become, just a commodity where prices keep inflating and rents keep doubling until you hit a bubble, and then the ones who are hurt the most are those who have the least, right? And again, the investors will benefit from any crisis, and we go back to these cycles. So I do think that we need to have stability in the whole. I mean, for families, for anybody, stability is important, and housing is one of those, in our opinion, right? Those areas where we need more stability. We need to have better systems in place where people don't lose their homes and go to foreclosure. They have to sell, but there's stability, right? There's more stability. We have a property tax assessment that is, yes, generating income, but also not taxing disproportionately the most vulnerable to fix the larger problems that we have. We want to make sure that we, developers and, investors pay their fair share, and unfortunately right now in Chicago, we don't have that. We have constitutional bans on any kind of rent stabilization. We have a property tax system that basically subsidizes the people who have more money because they'll pay the same amount than the average family, so we need to make sure that with all those have to be considerations, so we have a system that works. I think the thing that holds us back is unfortunately big money in politics, right? The big money in politics is a big problem. So developers still have a big into, corporations that have still, so they are defining the policies and the pace and the change that we want to see, which is urgent. We have 80,000 people homeless today in Chicago. I mean, a lot of times in our community say, look, there are more and more homeless in the viaducts. There's more, hunger. There's more issues, right? And, unfortunately, the result is more austerity. And the austerity is a result of corporations avoiding taxes. Developers don't want to pay their fair share. and profit has become the end of everything. So we got to make sure that we talk about stability, a conscious development, right? And at the end of the day, a system that works for everyone, not only for those few. When we have families barely making ends meet, we have families who work 2-3 jobs just to barely make it, and the kids are left behind, at home, right? How we can consider, that a reality when we have a CEO that makes $50,000 in 1 hour, right? I mean, these things, that they make in 1 hour, what the family has to put together, going to 2-3 jobs and sacrificing their own family. That gross inequality is a problem, right? We have people who are afraid of getting sick. They don't have coverage. They have part-time workers who barely can, afford rent, or, needless to say, there are seniors who barely can eat with the income they receive. But yet, we have generated, as a society, as a country, trillions of dollars of wealth. So the distribution of wealth is problematic, right? And at the end of the day, the better, and we all know that we are better off when our middle class grows, when we take people out of poverty. And we're not doing that. We're going backwards, right? And I think that's something I live on my own, on my own reality. The reason why I came here, because in Ecuador when I grew up, that's what the country, completely, went bankrupt. We have bankers who lend themselves, and corporations who didn't pay taxes, and they took more and more from the poor, and the politicians that legitimized it to the point that it wasn't unsustainable. And as a result, in a country of 11 million people at the time, or 12 million, 1 million people left, right, for a lack of opportunities, and that's what we continue to see, right? But I also continue to see here people leaving the city, 250,000 residents who left. Not because there's no wealth being generated, it's because there's more accumulation in the hands of a few. So we have to make sure that, like I said, our political system, and that's what I became involved, because at the end of the day, the rules of the market, the rules that we have as a society are determined by our government. And our government has to be representing the public good. Unfortunately, right now, we see more and more, and worse with the person that we have, unfortunately, in the White House. We see the consolidation of corporate greed, and the inequality of individualism, and is every man for his own, every person for his own benefit, and that is going to destroy the foundation of our communities. When we want to level the playing field, we see what is made. Our communities thrive, and this country to thrive is the safety nets, right? Quality public education, housing, social security, access to quality medical care. All those things that are risks today. And those are the things that affect the most vulnerable. And not because the country has gone poorer. There's obviously more wealth being generated, but the concentration of wealth, the tax evasion. I mean, we see Alderman here who are being lawyers and advocating for tax breaks for the very rich in government, right? So when we have to see, when we talk about how we're going to fix the issues, well, we got to pay our fair share, and that's not what's been happening right now. So the big money in politics is a problem, right? And I think that we have a responsibility to change that reality right now, to make sure that we have good policy that represent our democratic values, that represent the values of our community as a community that, and I think I'm very convinced of this, that the strong foundations that we have as a society have to be on our ability to look at policy from the perspective of the most vulnerable. If we're addressing those needs, and I think those safety net programs are intended to do that, so we level the playing field, so we can all thrive. But at the extent that we keep cutting and cutting, the result is the violence that we see, the homelessness that we see, more youth that have not, don't have access to the resources that they need, and it's just not acceptable. So I think that we take upon ourselves to participate, to be active, to organize, to ask questions, to have a government that really represents the needs and the values that I think that we share, the vast majority of people in Chicago and across the country, I believe, have.